I've read quite a bit of history about the province of Fujian, where I think about 40%, half of the Southeast Asian Chinese originally came from. Historically, because that region is full of mountains, people do not really have much easy access inland, and then people actually go from towns to towns, land to land, across the sea. So people have been navigating through the sea over like 1,000 years. And historically, almost every dynasty, at some point of time, there was a push to say that there's a problem with piracy, there's the problem of conspiracy with the Japanese warlords. So at every point of time, some governments try to restrict trade. The challenge is that it's a vast coastline with lots of bays and the mountains, and it's very difficult to police. So people found ways to trade, and it just carried on for so many years.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Join us at the Startup Conference Echelon X. Engage with over 10,000 of Asia's innovators and decision makers on May 15 and 16 at the Singapore Expo. We have 30 exclusive complimentary tickets for our podcast listeners. Sign up and use the promo codes BravePod or ECXJeremy to claim your free tickets now. Hey, Jianggan, it's good to see you.
Hey, hi, morning.
This is the start of a regular feature where we're going to be chatting about China and Southeast Asia on a regular basis. So really excited to have you on the show because you're really quite an expert, obviously, with your work, your experience on all sides of this wonderful region. And also, I think, a great author as well. I'm just singing your praises now, but could you share a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure. Hi. Oh gosh, share about myself. Born in China, came to Singapore when I was 16. Worked in mobile internet since 2013. Dealt with all the countries in Southeast Asia and had a brief stint in India, Middle East, and Latin America. And during the pandemic, wrote a book together with the Professor Guoli Chen of INSEAD to talk about how difficult it is for Chinese tech companies outside China.
Yeah. Could you share the title of the book and we'll hyperlink to it?
But the title is called Seen the Unseen, behind Chinese tech giants' global venturing. Seen the Unseen was the name put by the publisher because they said that they want something attractive. But the real essence is that we use lots of case studies from people like Alibaba, like Tencent, like Baidu, like Huawei, like Oppo. I mean, all these tech companies from China who have been trying to sort of expand outside China over the last like decade or so. And there are lots of stories, lots of lessons, lots of case studies along the way.
Yeah, amazing. I think what we want to do is for this first one is talk about the general like relationship between China and Southeast Asia. So for me, I think my question I have is it feels like China and Southeast Asia wasn't really a big topic, I would say, in the news, say 6 years ago. And now it seems to be like something that's always in the news and so forth. It's like flow of people, flow of capital, flow of companies as well. So what do you think is going on at a macro level?
I think at the macro level, I mean, first is I had this long lunch with this famous historian in China about 2 weeks ago in Beijing. And he was trying to, for 10 years, he was trying to understand what exactly caused China to become China today. And this theory, which was very interesting for him, that he has discovered over the years, that there was this tax reform in China in 1990, which made almost all the taxes go to the central government. And the local governments were deprived of tax. Instead, central government gave them a leeway saying that, hey, you can build on land, you can sell land, you can collect all the fees related to land. So that caused lots of local governments to study the developing real estate. I think today you see all the property bubble, etc., etc. I think the roots came from there. But they also developed lots of industrial parks. And his theory is that local governments developed too many industrial parks, which were empty. And when China joined the WTO in early 2000s, and all the outsourcing requests from Western companies came. And that allowed that empty land with lots of people who were enterprising, but who didn't have the proper jobs, very quickly unleashed lots of manufacturing potential. And how is that relevant to Southeast Asia? And if you look at geographical proximity between China and Southeast Asia and the existence of a large Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, which meant that I think in the early boom of manufacturing in China, lots of Southeast Asian companies actually went to benefit. I mean, robot Kuok's Kerry is well known in China, and the the cooking oil they have is a household name, but not many people know that's from Malaysia. I think Indonesians went to build like paper mills and stuff. So you see this business connection has been there since 1980s, 1990s. But over the years, this exchange allowed the Chinese side to see that Southeast Asia has a closed market that they can tap into. Obviously, as time progresses, China becomes more saturated and people are looking for outside markets to either sell their produce or expand their business models. And for many of them, Southeast Asia just sounded natural, right? I mean, I'm not sure whether it's the right analogy, but if you look at the US, naturally they're looking to Latin America to see, okay, where are the opportunities to move your manufacturing, to expand your market access, etc. So I think it's just all natural.
Yeah. I think I love what you said about history as well, because I also love history. And there's also a long history of Chinese relationship with Southeast Asia, right? I mean, go back hundreds of years. Admiral Zheng He sailing his treasure ships, right? Down south into China to India and the middle there. So a lot of long history over hundreds of years. And obviously, I myself am a person of part of that heritage. My great grandparents left China and that wave of time and turmoil in China. And there are actually multiple waves of Chinese migrants ethnic to Southeast Asia, right? So I think it's no surprise, like you said, that there's a diaspora element as well. And that's created what people call the bamboo network, which is the like a diaspora of trading ethnic Chinese with mainland China, but also with East Asia and Southeast Asia. So very interesting history dynamic for sure. So I feel maybe one thing in my head was that inspired what you just said is that it's less about the fact that there's new surge of Chinese wave capital. More there was a time period when Southeast Asia was very focused to the US since colonial times, I guess, so to the Western powers, and obviously with America after World War II. But now that China's reopened, it's like a return to the normal, I guess, of a lot of trade and people flows with China.
Yeah, I think it's just also China becoming more open, right? So now if you look at the global trade order for the last 20 years, China is probably probably the biggest beneficiary. It allowed it to develop its industry. It allowed it to sell lots of things across the world. And obviously has very interest to defend the current trade order, despite the fact that it didn't set up this order. The order is actually set up by the West.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like you mentioned that, because the order in Southeast Asia, I was actually reading the history of Southeast Asia, and it was quite interesting because every couple of dynasties, there'll be a lot of engagement from the dynasty with Southeast Asia. And then suddenly, for example, Admiral Zheng He, he's like coming by every couple of years of Southeast Asia. So everybody's expecting him. And then suddenly all his expeditions stop because the dynasty becomes inward facing, right?
Yeah. And the funny thing is that I've read quite a bit of history about the province of Fujian, where I think about 40% half of the Southeast Asian Chinese originally came from. And historically, because that region is full of mountains and access, I mean, it's pretty much like Greece in a way, right? People do not really have much easy access inland. And then people actually go from towns to towns and plateaus, land to land across the sea. So people have been navigating through the sea over like more than 1,000 years. And historically, you look at, I mean, almost every dynasty at some point of time, there was a push to say that, okay, there's a problem with piracy, there's the problem of conspiracy with the Japanese warlords, etc., etc. So at every point of time, some governments try to restrict trade. The challenge is that it's a vast coastline with lots of bays and mountains and stuff. It's very difficult to police. So historically, people found ways to trade, and it just carried on for so many years. But obviously, whatever that happened in the center of power in Nanjing, in Beijing, or in Xi'an would still impact the intensity of the trade and also how trade is formalized, right? I mean, if the government allows it, they usually set up ports, set up customs, etc., collect fees, collect taxes. But if it's restricted, you have other parties, people setting up trading posts in Taiwan, for example, and sometimes the Ryukyu Islands, the Okinawa, benefit from that. So the dynamics have been shifting like of the millennia. But yeah, so it's not that, okay, people found this new love for trade since 1980s. I mean, yeah, it has been in that region for like hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that as well, because if you ask my dad, he'll probably say it's Cantonese, and my mom would say she's Hokkien. Obviously, Fujian province, right? There's that dialect or geographic line that's there. But yeah, it's interesting to see that because both of these are like the southern provinces of China, which obviously is actually the closest to Southeast Asia as well. So I think there's this interesting spectrum of trade.
Yeah, and the thing about Guangdong, where Cantonese came from, at some point of time before, I think for many years before the Opium War forced China to open more trading ports, I think all the trade had to go through Guangdong, go through Guangzhou or Canton. So that enriched the region, the Pearl River Delta, greatly. But that also caused lots of pain for people from other coastal provinces because they have to physically transport the goods over land to Canton and over the mountains and stuff to trade. So that was not very efficient. But there are lots of like interesting consequences that allowed guilds to form in Guangzhou, and that actually impacted how trade was carried out and how trade was financed and how competition was regulated. But that also created the fact that and Cantonese became the lingua franca, right? I mean, in sort of the southern China trade ecosystem, people from Chaozhou or Teochew speaking areas, I mean, everybody in the past, if you're engaged in some of business, you speak Cantonese because you have to trade via Canton. So lots of interesting dynamics. And I do think to a large extent, for you to understand exactly why things are happening today, it's always interesting to go back to history because lots of things are not sudden.
And I think I love what you said, because if you go to America, for example, almost all of the immigrants who are in America speaking Cantonese. So there's that multiple ways of immigration.
And there are some unintended consequences. I've read this take a full account of the history of drug trafficking in the Americas, and apparently in the 1880s to 1920s or something like that, the Cantonese actually run the largest drug trafficking network in Mexico, because lots of them sort of went to California to work, and some of them filtered through to Mexico. At that time, so basically the thesis is that if you want to buy drugs, go to the town, find that den or that inn operated by somebody with a ponytail or something.
Oh yeah, the Manchu style Qing Dynasty.
Imperial Chinese haircut, yeah. And they operated that network, so it's way before Pablo Escobar.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's interesting because we're also talking about the ways of immigration in history, right? I think there's also other folks who are also in all around the world. I think the Hainanese are here as well, a good chunk of them as well, as southernmost island off the coast. So obviously Singapore talks about Hainanese chicken rice and Hainanese curry, for example, the food styles.
And Hainanese prime minister now.
That's true. I forgot about that. You reminded me, this came out. Apparently it's quite popular in China now because all the Hainan folks are like, wow, one of our, I don't know, great-grandchildren became the prime minister in Singapore, right? Floated on the boat south. Yeah, it's crazy. And actually, it's interesting because what I was reading in Singapore history was that the Hainanese were one of the later folks to move south into Southeast Asia. So they found like a lot of their roles were not as good as, for example, the Cantonese, because the Cantonese had come primarily based on trading. They've been around for longer. So the Hainanese had to do a lot of the cooking, the chef jobs, a lot of the blue-collar jobs that had already been filled by either the Hokkien folks or the Cantonese folks. That's why in Singapore, you have the Hainanese chicken rice, Hainanese curry. It's all because of that influence. And then as a result, I think the Hainanese, supposedly for a time, they were like worse off economically, right? Because they were working from more blue-collar jobs. But like I said, now the Hainanese are integrated well into Singapore. And now you have Lawrence Wong, right? The new Prime Minister of Singapore.
And we talk about Hainanese have to undertake the jobs, so culinary art or in cooking, in running restaurants and stuff. In a way, is it similar to how Italians found footing in the US and why Italian food became so popular? Because there are just so many Italian immigrants who just opted to be in the restaurant trade.
Yeah. And after that, the Chinese came afterwards, and then they were only allowed to work running laundromats and restaurants in America as well. They also had to, that's why you have so many Chinese restaurants everywhere, right? Of course, it's all Southern Chinese and also low cost, because it's not imperial Chinese, northern style or Sichuan style. It's all Southern Chinese base.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you go to Europe regularly, and if you look at almost all the like Chinese restaurants in West Europe, they're best operated by people from this particular city called in Zhejiang, right? You go to Italy, you go to Spain, you go to France, you see all these like Chinese takeaway restaurants, and they are almost exactly the same. The name is different, but the decor is almost exactly the same. I mean, the food they serve is exactly the same. And you need to be Chinese to go there and completely ignore the menu and ask the chef saying that, hey, what vegetables do you have at your kitchen? You stir fry some dishes for me instead of selling me this fake Vietnamese spring roll.
That's right. No, I went on a car ride from south of Italy to north of Italy, right? So from Naples all the way to Milan. And I felt like as I drove north, I saw more Asian people, Chinese people. And then the Japanese restaurants were being run by the Chinese as well as the Chinese restaurants. But I think when I hit Milan and so forth, I actually was surprised by how many Chinese people there were because of the trade links between the luxury industry and on, right? So I was just really surprised by that.
And over the last 20 to 30 years, and many of these people from Wenzhou, initially they went there to trade. And they would trade cheap Wenzhou wear, was used to be quite famous for its shoes and stuff. But over the last 20 years, you see lots of them have started buying up traditional Italian workshops and with the brand name, with the story. And they turned that into a more sophisticated, a more modern sort of operation. And that, of course, is legitimately made in Italy. And because many of these guys, they're second generation, they're third generation, they take Italian passports, etc. So now you see lots of the medium, smaller brands from Italy. They're actually run by people from Wenzhou. And it's actually quite common. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a surprise because I was talking to the tour guide and her day job was a teacher. And She was just saying like she's teaching a lot of the second generation or third generation kids. And she was explaining that, like you said, they had brought their families, the kids, and then the owners obviously also bring in more labor from China to work in Italy. Because like you said, the rules are like you want to have a brand that's made in Italy, but it can be made in Italy by Chinese labor with Chinese materials from China as well. And so there's this huge corridor that's actually happening where obviously there's local assimilation integration where they speak Italian. I saw them dressed very stylishly, better than me in my Uniqlo. And then it was interesting to see. But also I think it helped me understand during the pandemic, the first place the pandemic happened was in Wuhan. And then the second place it popped up was in Italy. I was always so confused at the start of the pandemic. I was like,
yeah. It was
it's so far apart, right? That's the weirdest connection. And then you're like, oh, it's because of that. Like you said, the leather work materials trade between both countries, between those two cities actually caused that dynamic.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with, since we talk about leather trade, a few years ago, I spent a week in a great, maybe not forgotten city of Calcutta in India. And I'm not sure if you're aware that in Calcutta, there used to be this is a fairly big Hakka population, Hakka Chinese population, and who basically run all the tanneries in the city, in the leather trade. So now if you go to that town has largely moved on. Many people have migrated to different parts of India or to the West, but you still see tons of Chinese restaurants. We go to some northern Indian restaurants, they usually serve what was called Indian Chinese, right? Of course, there's the momo, which the dumplings, which I think got into India via Tibet. But there's also this Hakka fried noodles, which is actually fairly popular across the Indian Chinese restaurants.
The Hakka made it there.
Oh yeah, they have mapo tofu, but instead of tofu, they put paneer, so it's mapo paneer.
Oh, I've never had that, but I'm also massively lactose intolerant, so probably not allowed to have it. But that sounds delicious. No, I think it's interesting, yeah, because it's a whole cuisine style. I can't remember the exact name. I think we'll have to look it up here. But yeah, I think it's a known cuisine style in India. And I was backpacking there and also saw that as well. But also, I think in Mexico as well, they also have the old school Chinese, the stir fry style in Central America as well, from the Chinese immigration wave as well. So I think it really shows up in the Chinese food everywhere. Like it gets localized.
Yeah, it does. Many years ago when I was still working for Rocket Internet, there's once we had a few colleagues coming to visit from Peru, from Lima, and basically stayed in Singapore for a few days. So I took them around to try different food, right? And I remember vividly that we went to a dim sum restaurant, and they said they seemed not surprised at all because they said, "Oh, we have dim sum in Lima," but I was thinking, okay, maybe it's just they like Chinese food or whatever. But then they said that there's actually a fairly large Cantonese population in Peru. And I remember at the table at the dim sum restaurant in Singapore, there's someone who just suddenly told me that, "Hey, pass me the chiao, like the soy sauce." I said, "Okay, you know this word?" And they said, "Yeah, this is how we call it in Peru, right? I mean, the soy sauce." And I actually go into restaurant, they call it chifa, which is like eat rice in Chinese or Cantonese.
Exactly. So that's what happened. I was backpacking in Peru as well. And I was very surprised that this diaspora existed, which kind of makes sense. I think hundreds of years ago, there was also like the California gold rush. There was a big emigration for opportunities in Americas. The railroads obviously were built, a lot of it with Chinese labor, until the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed by the anti-immigrant Congress at that time later on. So I think the border slammed shut at a certain point of time, but during that window, there was a lot of opportunity. And then, of course, on the other side of the table, I think China was in turmoil, right? So we had the fall of the Qing Dynasty. And after that, there was like the Civil War and then the Japanese invasion. So I think and then obviously there was the low economic growth for many years after that. So it's a stabilization dynamic era. I think a lot of people just left wherever they went. And now we're kind of starting to reconnect with each other because of the internet.
Yeah, that dynamic is interesting because people who arrived or who left at different points of time, of course, psychologically, they feel different. So I have a few uncles and aunties in my family. Back in the late 80s or early 90s, China, I mean, everybody wanted to go to the West. And the route is that, okay, you study really well in university, you go for the English tuition, and you find a grad school to go to in the West. So I have parts of the family in Boston and parts of the family in Calgary, in Canada. But it's kind of interesting that many of them, initially, they found it really hard to adapt, and it took them like how many years to find their footing. But some of them are saying that, hey, we left at the wrong time, 1990s, and you completely missed the miracle in China between late 90s to basically the last few years. And I don't know, it's like strange mixed feelings, right? I mean, I went to my aunt's house in Boston. It's like very nice house in the suburbs, and obviously everyone drives, and you have very nice dinner. You can go for a walk. There's woods right next to the house. But they were saying that they look at their former classmates back at university who stayed on in Beijing, and at least for the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Every time they go to Beijing, their friends always had like interesting stuff to tell them. But for them, staying in the suburbs of Boston, everything has been relatively stable for 20 years. Of course, you feel a little bit different and you feel like, okay, maybe I've missed something. But since the last 2 years, they felt a little bit better because I think the sentiment in China has sort of weakened a bit. So people have this kind of unease about the future. Bit of feeling that everything is saturated. I don't know where the growth is. I feel insecure, and COVID left a big psychological impact on people. So yeah, and maybe many people are telling them, saying that, hey, maybe it was the right decision after all for you to have left China.
The old Chinese practice, right? You send one kid overseas, you keep one kid here, right? You got to spread your bets on your kids. So yeah, it happens all the time, right? I think I was reading this also article about how somebody sent one kid to serve for the Kuomintang and they send another kid to serve for the communists. You just got to spread your bets a little bit here, diversification, right? Because things can go up, things can go down.
Yeah, you never know. You never know.
Yeah. I think what's interesting, like you said, is that different eras, and I think different waves, and they all have some similarities, but all getting to know each other. So I think the oldest wave in Southeast Asia, I think that now they're called like Peranakan, right? So I think that's probably like they assimilated, integrated, they intermarried with primarily the Malay and indigenous populations. So they have a blend of both Chinese and Malay customs. Obviously, and they got relatively rich as a class because, like you said, they were trading a lot with the trading Chinese. And then, of course, later on, when the colonial empire came, a lot of them were used to be promoted to manage commerce and so forth. So I think as a colonial administrator / third party, right? So that was an interesting first wave. And then, like I said, I think the second wave, like I said, is around those are, I guess, from today's perspective, the great grandparents and grandparents. So that's like your trading Chinese, but also those who left early. And then, like I said, now is the newest wave, which is maybe like this current generation seems to be one set of flow as well.
And I think there are also new dynamics. I mean, obviously we talked about previously about all these businesses which are expanding to Southeast Asia, and of course with these businesses that some people came. One of the stories that people often talk about is the Hokkien that founded J&T Express in Indonesia, and it started with the Oppo distributor in one province, Eastern China, was sent to Indonesia saying that, hey, here's your market to develop. It's a vast market. Nobody knows how to sell smartphones there. Go and figure out. So they took a few years to figure out. What I find amazing is that they brought lots of people from China with them there, and that they really found a way to work with the local team really well. And to date, they still run a large ecosystem. And in addition to J&T Express, there have been many other companies, right? Tomorrow Coffee, YOU, the brand for cosmetics, and they are distributing for this bubble tea store in China called Tianlala, which copied exactly Mixue, and they're distributing that. They are, I mean, basically they're doing multiple JVs with multiple Chinese companies because now they have to figure out how to do business locally and how to work with local executives and how to manage the local workforce and how to basically respect the local culture. This is something that I think many of the newcomers, they don't know how to do it because for many businesses in China, they're relatively young. I mean, so the communists wiped out almost everything in the mid-20th century. All the businesses that you see coming out of China, they were basically started in like 1980s, 1990s, some of them like 2010s. So all of these businesses are relatively new. And for the entire history that they have been in existence, it was a surge in economic growth in China. So now they have to deal with different reality, meaning that okay, Chinese market is saturated. They have to deal with entering different markets, and they have to deal with the complexities of navigating through different markets, which I think many of the American and Japanese MNCs took decades to learn back in 70s, 80s, and 90s. But these guys, because of the speed they are used to China, they probably do not have the patience they probably do not know how to slow down. So that caused lots of friction. And as you can see often in the news.
Yeah, it was a dinner party last night that they were just chatting about how they work for, I guess, Singaporean, I would say subsidiary or division, Southeast Asia division of a Chinese company. And then sure, the other person was like, oh, how's it like for the 996 work culture?
Oh, 996? I'm not sure where they originally came from, Jack Ma or somebody else, but Jack Ma, I mean, of Alibaba certainly popularized this term, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. So basically 12 hours times 6 is 72 hours a week, which is almost twice the normal working hours in most advanced countries, right? So at some point of time, it was priced because you work hard, you get rewarded, and of course the company grows faster than your competitors. But if everyone starts to do the same and there's no growth in top line market, and it became what people call even 内卷, and then the rewards became more scarce and had to be distributed with more people. So now 996 is almost a taboo in China. People don't really talk about it, but when you go to companies, you will see that it's many of the companies which are still practicing top-down control, long working hours, etc., etc. But in tech, you already see lots of companies who try to steer away from that. But it is not easy because if your competitors are aggressive, And it's very hard for you to afford to say that I give people work-life balance, etc. Because lots of the work still need to be done by humans, right? I mean, if you look at e-commerce, lots of the work from logistics, you have to have humans to do it. And e-commerce operations, you have people to upload campaigns, edit images, set price, talk to people for customer service, etc. So you still need lots of people. So you still need lots of people, and the hours matter. I think that's probably the reason why the e-commerce platforms in China have been investing so much into AI. They are trying to find an edge without working the human labor too hard. But of course, the other side of the coin, when you look at it, is are they looking to replace all these humans, which could potentially render lots of people jobless? So there's always this argument and a dynamics and tension there. But yeah, back to a dinner party.
Yeah, that's why everybody in Southeast Asia still asks about 996, because it's not yet taboo. Everybody's like asking about the work culture. But I think it's interesting about what you said about the work culture, because fundamentally it's about the competition for labor. If there's a lot of, when labor is short, then obviously labor gets more negotiating power, get more leverage, and can negotiate for better working hours. I always was reading this fun economist article, and basically was saying that the Europeans earn about 20 to 30% less than Americans on a per capita basis, person basis. But also individually, they also work 20 to 30% less hours than the Americans. It's actually a fair amount of productivity.
Okay, which means that they're compensated fairly, right? Because of this hours trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the economist was basically saying like productivity factor is roughly similar across the West between Europe and America. I don't know if they should do something on that's working almost twice as hard as, definitely twice as hard as, in terms of hours as the Europeans. I wonder whether it shows up as 2 times more productive.
What's interesting, I've been speaking with a lot of factory owners in the Pearl River Delta who are engaged in cross-border trade and some of the suppliers of companies like Shein, etc. So over the last few years, many of them have been exploring like setting up factories outside China. I mean, some of them went to Vietnam, some of them went to Cambodia, and the more enterprising ones went to Turkey and Mexico. I have heard from multiple people that when you measure about the absolute productivity, like per hour, how much you actually generate per hour for the labor in all these countries, and most of them are telling us that it's remarkably consistent, right? I mean, somebody who was operating a textile factory in Guangzhou, and he set up a subsidiary in Turkey, and he said Turkish workers produce as much as the Chinese workers, and then when they set up something in Mexico, they realized that actually some of the Mexicans are actually slightly faster than the Chinese workers, and etc. So basically, there isn't much material difference, but there's always this notion that for many of the Chinese bosses that, okay, it's hard. I mean, people from other places are lazier compared to the Chinese. But once you start managing the business, you will know that, okay, this is a fallacy, right? So people who are willing to make up hard work, and especially people who are migrants. So the people who went to Mexico to open up factories, many of them actually have their factories close to the US border. And the employees that they employ are coming from different parts of Mexico, or sometimes from other countries in Latin America. And they realize that people who are willing to pack up and move to another place for a better life, they're probably willing to work hard. And this is something different when they realized in parts of Southeast Asia where you largely hire from the nearby townships. So he said the level of drive from people who actually work out of their hometowns is very different from the level of drive for people who migrate. And I think this is something they see internally in China as well. I mean, when they set up a factory, when they hire people from nearby villages versus they hire people who move across different provinces to work, the motivation is different. But if somebody has the right motivation and their productivity, it's probably very similar across different places. But one thing they mentioned to me is that in many countries, because of the regulations, and of course, down to each individual level, per hour basis, the productivity is the same. But because of regulations, they could not organize labor the way they do in China. How does it work? I mean, in China, if you have a factory, if you have a surge in orders, whether coming from e-commerce platforms or coming from trading partners, you typically go to the labor market saying that, hey, I need 500 workers next day, and I'm willing to pay a little bit extra. In many countries, it's simply not allowed. In many countries, you have to enter proper contracts before something can work for you. In many countries, and the minimum employment period is like 1 month if you employ someone full time, etc., etc. And the tax treatment is different. So I think in China, there's depth in the supply chain. There's lots of flexibility in how labor could be arranged. Even though the government has fairly pro-labor sort of legislation, but when it gets implemented in different cities, you have the local governments helping businesses to actually make some flexibilities.
Yeah, awesome. We covered a lot. We learned a lot about, obviously, the history between China and Southeast Asia engagement. I think the different ways of immigration in terms of history and time, but also in terms of the various provinces that from China. And also, we got to talk a little bit about the latest wave of immigration in terms of the companies and their work culture and in terms of productivity. On that note, thank you so much, and see you next time.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.